Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. And as always, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our evening program. Tonight's program is Yiddish, a Global Culture, Bold Lives, Boundless Creativity with David Mazower. Before we start, I'd also like to give a heartfelt thanks to Ria Schwartz and Paul Wolf, whose generous support made publication of the catalog possible. A few housekeeping details before we get started. Your audio and your video will be off throughout the program. You may send us questions via the question panel, which is at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short and refrain from comments so that we can try to get to everyone's questions this evening. David Mazower is the Yiddish Book Center's research bibliographer and editorial director, and the chief curator of the center's permanent exhibition, Yiddish, a Global Culture, and the author of the companion exhibition catalog. Before we start this evening's conversation, we're going to share a short slideshow with you, which will provide you with a little peek inside some of the pages of the catalog in case you haven't received yours yet. Following this 4-minute slideshow, David will join me in conversation. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, David, for joining me this evening. I have to say, we lived with doing the exhibition for several years. The catalog, which has just been published, took us a couple of years. And honestly, thank you.
Thank you.
Every time I see it, there's something else I glean from it. So before we get started kind of digging into it a little bit, I thought it might be interesting to hear your take. You curated an exhibition and then you authored a catalog. How did you go from one to the other? Because they're two different engagements.
Yeah, I mean they're sort of two halves of a whole. They both, do something that I think we all felt was different and needed to be done, which is to say that, there are many books and exhibitions that focused either on Eastern Europe, on the Polish Yiddish scene, the Polish Jewish scene, perhaps on the American, the New York Jewish and Yiddish scene. There are not so many that really connect the dots from Berlin to Buenos Aires to Birmingham, from Montreal to Mexico City to Melbourne, and all sorts of places in between that really, I guess, make a case for this being a coherent world culture, a coherent world civilization. So, I think both the exhibition and the book make that case and do so in a way that not so many people have done in exactly this sort of survey introductory way. I mean, there are many books of scholarship that,
Mhm.
have this as the backdrop for sure. But as a sort of museum and a presentation for a general audience, which both the exhibition and the catalogue are, that's the given. But yes, translating one to the other was just like a whole different sort of ball game, wasn't it? Really, a whole different set of storytelling sort of requirements, a whole different set of spatial relationships. The catalogue is a radical selection from the exhibition, but both are storytelling exercises at root. We present this picture through a whole set of dozens and hundreds of stories, and so in that way also the catalogue, you know, partners with the exhibition.
And I can't ask everybody to raise their hand in the audience because we can't see you to see if you've been to the exhibition yet. But the exhibition has a set of things in it. The catalog does not include everything, although it also has other elements. You commissioned David Roskies to do a sort of overview for people. Maybe talk a little bit about that. There's a comprehensive timeline in there, which also is not part of the exhibition and adds so much um, to this. And then I'll ask you to speak a little bit about the curator's note, which I think is a really interesting jumping off point for how this represents so much of the way that you approach telling the story of Yiddish culture.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think we always wanted this book to be, the perfect gift book, the perfect sort of introductory survey, a book that you can give friends, you can give parents and grandparents, you can give children and grandchildren. That there's not, I love some of the books that digest the Yiddish world for us in a more scholarly way, but that is not what we've done here. We've really sort of made it a sort of starting entry point, I think. So it needed to be a self-contained book. Obviously, as you say, the bulk of it is taken from the exhibition. I really wanted there to be a sort of overarching essay that tied several centuries of the Yiddish literary story, especially together. And no better person to do that than Professor David Roskies, and it's a really beautiful, elegant essay that adds that sort of storytelling arc to 300 or 400 years of Yiddish literature primarily. The timeline, yes, is not in the exhibition, and it's a really comprehensive 15-page timeline. It's its own anthology, if you like. It's its own sort of history in a sense. It's full of nuggets, surprising, pieces of information, events, phenomena, right up to 2025. Um, that fit into this framework of the Jewish engagement with modernity and the emergence of Yiddish as a mass culture through literature, the theater, the press, music, and so on. And I guess in a sense, it gives us the luxury of putting all sorts of really fascinating things in that are just not in the exhibition and that will lead you straight to Google. And, there was a Pope who spoke Yiddish. The second biggest funeral in the history of New York City, second only to a president, was a Yiddish activist who most people, even in the Yiddish world, have not heard of today. So, I won't give the game away, but that's the sort of example of the things that are in the timeline.
It's a timeline that only you could have written, if I may, because it's not a straightforward, this happened on this date, we built this, and yeah.
Yeah, it was hard, obviously, weighing up what to put in and what not. But in a sense, the criteria was this prism of Yiddish as a pioneering modern force that's influenced and exerted its weight around the world, but also reflects, cultures and events around it. And so the sort of essential determinant for the timeline was really the same idea of things that sort of have had a mass moment, a mass appeal, a mass audience. Why did 5,000 people turn up in 1925 in Palestine in the Hebrew Writers Union to witness a debate about whether the Dybbuk, this play by Ansky, should be licensed for performance in Mandate Palestine? 5,000 people over the course of a week felt it important enough to give up their time to attend that debate. And the details of it are wild, and that, there's not time to put the details in the timeline, but just that fact, which so few of us, I mean, I didn't know this until I started reading up, thinking what to put in the timeline, and it just blew my mind that it's, there are 5,000 people in the open air courtyard of the Hebrew Writers Union listening to the great names of Hebrew writing and literature, inveighing against this polluting, despicable, diasporist play, and it's an extraordinary event.
So let's move to the curator's note. And we didn't really rehearse anything, so I'm going to put you on the spot, if I may. I think there's a passage in your curator's note, which actually you did read once, which explains sort of how you come to this whole idea and how we ended up with an exhibition that is so infused with your enthusiasm and your curiosity for Yiddish. And that became a framework for, I think it's safe to say, the exhibition and how it's approached and how the storytelling works.
Yeah, I mean, the exhibition, draws heavily on the wonderful collections that we have at the Yiddish Book Center. But we have a very sort of skewed, random collection of books that have all been donated. We've never gone out and bought and accumulated books like a traditional library would. Um, so it was a sort of that was the starting point for the exhibition, if you like. But in terms of how we sort of how we put the jigsaw together, yeah, it draws on, and I reflected this in the catalog, and I guess that's the passage you're maybe thinking about. I ended up thinking about my journey to Yiddish, which was in my 20s. Um, I had grown up as the great grandson of the Yiddish writer Sholem Asch in London. But without having any Yiddish in the family, very sort of secular family background. I didn't have a bar mitzvah, barely set foot in a synagogue for many, many years. Um, so this was all something of a mystery to me, which I kind of found my way to in my 20s, and I found my way to it through my getting to know the last of the Yiddish actors in London. So I talk about that. And they were the ones who kind of shone the light on my past and told me my story. Um, and so, the world of the Yiddish actors was the popular theater, the song and dance, sketch world, sort of Yiddish music theater. And in my mind, that has always been the sweet spot in the Yiddish cultural story, whether it's popular literature, popular theater, popular song, whatever. And I don't think of it in terms of high culture and low culture, elite and anything else. I think of it very much as a coherent whole. And I guess the exhibition reflects that, and also reflects this idea of a culture that was, really sustained and kept alive by its audiences. So it's not just about the creators; it's very much about the readers, the theater audience, and those sort of people.
So let's dive in a little bit into the book itself and the process. First slide, Elizabeth. So first, obviously, we have the cover. We went through a lot to try to figure out what should go on the cover, and this just became so apparent. I think there's something about this picture that you found that really suggests what's inside. It could be then and it could be now. The same picture could be taken.
Yeah, I mean, mass culture, mass gatherings, mass audiences, 3,000 seat theaters in New York and Odessa and Buenos Aires. Those are at the heart of the exhibition and the catalog. I think, having a photograph of people looking out at you, which this one does. This is a picnic of the London Bundists, so Jewish socialists, immigrant workers, although they're dressed up in their sort of best. But you look closely and you see a wonderful range of sort of Russian peasant shirts and homemade embroidered dresses and so on. They're young, there are children there. This is the sort of prime moment of the Bund, the Workers' Party. In the 1900s, the Bund is actually way bigger than either the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks in the Russian Empire. And so in migration, Bundist circles and Bundist groups like this one in London are, they've got the sort of wind in their sails. And so you can see this pride, the confidence. They're celebrating the launch of their party newspaper that some of them are holding. It's just a wonderful, wonderful photograph. The faces, the mix of people, and so on. This is a photograph from the YIVO Institute, a fabulous, fabulous archive and source of many of our pictures, indeed. And I've always loved it from the moment I saw it many years ago. Yeah.
I'm gonna move on, but it also reminds me, and we're looking at the book sitting here in front
Mm.
of us on the table. It's an exhibition catalog, and we went back and forth a lot, many times about calling it an exhibition catalog. And in the end, we decided to put a subhead in, and that subhead is Bold Lives, Boundless Creativity. And I think those two things speak to what's inside. And to touch on that just for a bit.
Yeah, these are people who had hard lives, undoubtedly. I mean, we're looking at this photograph, and these are shoemakers and tailors and cigarette rollers, and people working in the markets. Really hard lives, 12, 14-hour days. But at the same time, they've uprooted themselves, they've left family, they've gone in search of a completely unknown future. They've found a community, they've created their own community, they've refashioned themselves. And this idea of transformation, I think, is at the heart of so much that's exciting and interesting about this culture, the literature, the theater, the people. So that, I guess, is the bold lives part, and yes, boundless creativity. I mean, it is full of people doing extraordinary things, as we'll see perhaps in some of the other pictures.
Right. And Elizabeth, next slide, please, which is just quickly to give a sense of going from the exhibition. And this is laying out the book. And the exhibition is 16 different sort of sections, as it were.
Mhm.
And most of those are represented. And maybe just touch a little bit that, and then we're going to get into some more specifics.
Yeah, so just as in the exhibition, the big sections in the book are the theater, the literature, or at least the world, the sort of literary world in its fullness, the theater, the press, music, and politics. Those are the things that we give most weight to in the book, but we also have sections on women's voices. That's really the gender politics of the Yiddish cultural world. We have a section on the Holocaust. We have a post-war and a contemporary section, and we have Peretz's salon. Maybe we'll come on to that. A specific sort of immersive space in the exhibition that explores this really extraordinary laboratory of modern Yiddish culture that ran in the home apartment of Peretz in Warsaw from 1890 to 1915, and incubated just an extraordinary array of talent.
So next slide, please. Again, we approach this in the same way. And
Yeah, this is one of the introductory sections. You and Mike Mike Grinley, the designer, worked incredibly hard and thought incredibly deeply about these introductory headings to each section. And I think the printer made this special color for us.
I got a
We got a
special.
special color,
Yeah.
which we like. Yeah, so this is the introduction to bestsellers. This is another extraordinary photograph. I mean, I won't go on at length about it, but the thirst for culture, the fascination with novelty. This is a guy with a horse and cart turning up in the shtetl to sell books, or probably to rent books overnight, mostly to young women who just pay, a kopeck, a few kopecks, a few cents to borrow and return the books because that's cheaper than actually buying the book. That's how it worked. So again, it's this sort of idea of a mass phenomenon, a crowd of kids, eager to understand what's going on here. Who is this guy who's turned up in the shtetl? What's in his cart? What are these front covers of women in peril and detectives, superheroes, and so on. So I love this photograph. We don't know much about it, but it's re a really extraordinary image.
And it's a section bestsellers, and again, it's your way of introducing us to this popular literature and the readers.
Yeah, it's a section in which we bring together that construct of the bestsellers, what were the best-selling books, allows us to bring together things like the Women's Bible, the Tzena Renner, this commentary that's been in print for hundreds of years, still today. And we bring that in sort of conversation with this so-called Schund literature, this pulp fiction of romance and detective and adventure stories, such as this guy with his horse and cart would be bringing into the shtetl. And indeed, my great-grandfather's novel, The Nazarene, which was a New York Times bestseller in 1939 and 1940 for many, many weeks. So just trying to understand, what was so important to people that they bought it and read it in vast quantities. And it's really not the things we might think of. It's not really Shalom Aleichem and some other things. It's a whole range of other things.
Next slide.
Yes, well, we were talking about Sholem Asch, and there he is. You can tell me we're going to put this one in. So that's Peretz in the center. I.L. Peretz, a really transformational, charismatic, towering figure in modern Jewish culture and certainly in modern Yiddish culture. And there, he's a very sort of playful guy. You get a sense of that from this photograph. They're out in the woods, probably somewhere near Warsaw. That's Peretz in the middle. The tall guy is my great-grandfather, Sholem Asch, probably around 26, 27 at this time. The guy lying on the ground is Hirsch David Nomberg, another member of the Salon, a friend of my great-grandfather's, a noted short story writer and activist and political figure, and also an obsessive tango dancer. We know that from many accounts. And the other guy holding the stick is Peretz's son Lucian, who was really adrift and really had a very, very tragic life. But anyway, it's Peretz with these two leading figures in his salon circle.
Okay, I'm going to move on. We'll come back to some of the questions related to this next. Um, this is another favorite of yours, and the story of this, I think, is so interesting in the way that this draws from our collection. It's a find.
Yeah, this is I mean, hopefully some of you are looking at we're seeing this quite small. I imagine you may be seeing it bigger on your screens. This is a truly stunning image from 1921 Poland, and it's an illustrated book. You can see the book to the left of the main image. This is one of a trio of limited edition works of expressionist poetry, but the prize in all of them are these extraordinary illustrations done by three young women artists at the start of their careers. This is by a woman called Dina Matus, a painter, illustrator, ceramicist, textile designer in early 20th century Poland. As I say, one of three books. I stumbled across the companion volume to this, one of the other books in the trilogy, one day at the center when we were just randomly looking through boxes of donated books. This box, I think, had been there a long time. We have no idea who donated the book, but and indeed it was super fragile and so really almost impossible to open because it was falling apart. But it was immediately obvious that here was something really unique. These illustrations are hand colored over lino print. Anyway, I couldn't really find out much about these books, which astonished me and still sort of astonishes me. And that has changed in the last 5 years. And, we've partly been responsible for that change, I'm happy to say. So I make a case in the exhibition and in the catalogue where we include examples of each of the three books for this really being every bit as important as the work we know by Chagall, by Lissitzky, by Rybak, by Tchekhov, by a whole host of artist illustrators who are at the forefront of this modernist moment in which artists and writers work hand in hand. And I think these illustrations by Dina Matus, Esther Karp, and Ida Breuner are every bit as important, in many ways actually more important than a lot of the work that was being done in their circle, which was the Young Yiddish circle in Lodz. There is nothing that is colored in this way that's so sort of carefully produced. And also the story behind it, I think, is that this is a feminist project led by one of the poets, a woman poet named Rachel Lipstein, because they were really pushed to the margins of this sort of male-centered group in which Yankel Adler and Moshe Brodersen and, really well-known men were at the center of this. But there are hardly any women who get into their journal, who they sort of let into to the pages of their journal. And, my reading, which may not be correct, but I think, you can make a case for it, is that these women essentially find a sponsor to pay for this work, and they kind of take matters into their own hands, and they produce this astonishingly beautiful set of books that are now super, super rare. There are 5 or 6 or 7 copies of each of them around the world. The Library of Congress just bought one for $40,000 to complete its set. They're the only library in the world that has a set. They're incredibly important. And so, I sort of plant my flag, in the ground with this work. And in a way, the exhibition and the catalogue disrupt the canon in ways that I think are productive and part of a much wider set of writers and scholars and people in the Yiddish world who are doing exactly the same thing and saying, we still really don't know this world. It looks radically different now to what it looked like a generation ago. We have a whole different set of authors that we value and prize and take seriously. And in 30 years' time, it's going to look radically different again because, the scholars in their 20s and 30s are going to find all sorts of things we know nothing about. There are science fiction novels in Yiddish we know nothing about. There are all sorts of writers we barely know about. So yeah, it's a sort of world in transition in terms of us looking into it, but also, that I think is reflected in the choices that we've made in the catalog as well.
And I think what's so exciting about this, and it's threaded through the book and through the exhibition, is that well, for me, I can say I'm finally able to see all of this creativity that was contemporaneous. And it was sophisticated, it was global, and it was, as I say, in conversation. And who would have thought that's not what I thought of as the
Yeah,
artwork that
I
would
have
have
to
come
say,
out. Yeah.
right, these are women aged 21, 22, 23. They've gone to art school in Vienna, Munich, Berlin. They've come back to Lodz post-war. It's this sort of apocalyptic world, pogroms are everywhere around. Um, and they create this extraordinary set of books. So I had a thought in mind, which I've now completely lost. But anyway, yeah.
So this is in the section called modernism, which again, it places Yiddish in that realm of modernism in terms of graphic design. So I'm giving you very little tidbits here, sorry. So the next one, just so you can give people a sense of the scope and the breadth of this. Next slide, please. I love this. It's one little story. Tells a larger story.
Yeah, this is the extraordinary Ita Kalish. This is, I think, in the section called Women's Voices, which, as I said, was really, it's a story of how women, force open the door of literary journals, of publishing houses, of newspaper columns to get themselves and their work noticed. But it's also just the story of thousands of women rebelling and trying to make, fashion the lives they want for themselves in a very traditional patriarchal world. And Ita Kalish grows up in Ukraine. I think she's born in 1903. Um, she comes from really quite a well-off Hasidic household. They have their own court. She probably has tutors as a child. But her destiny is marriage, motherhood, modesty as a prime value, and certainly not a creative life that she makes for herself. And her only way of doing that is to run away. And the price of running away for her is she has to leave her child behind. And she writes this extraordinary memoir much later on, looking back and really recalling this incredibly difficult decision she makes. She spends 6 years trying to get her child back. She eventually succeeds, and then they emigrate together to Palestine. Um, it's a book that she wrote in I think in Hebrew. I think I'm right in saying in Hebrew and Yiddish. I should know that. But anyway, never translated into English. And full of just vivid anecdotes about this, really tough process of leaving her family, her Hasidic family behind.
I'm wondering if you can, if I blow this up, read the quote, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, the quote is, I lived life my own way and as I pleased. I read forbidden books and went to the theatre and concerts in secret, lest, heaven forbid, father were to find out. Yeah.
Okay, next slide. Again, I was surprised to see Soviet Yiddish. Why Soviet Yiddish in an exhibition?
Yeah, so this is one of the sort of most closely focused thematic sections, if you like. We don't have another geographically focused section in the exhibition. We could have had something about Yiddish in Palestine, Israel, that would have been equally interesting. But I think the story, first of all, the story of Yiddish in the Soviet Union is really unique and uniquely sort of tortured, and has this extraordinary bright dawn in the post-revolutionary years through the 1920s, and then gradually and quickly sours in the 30s as Stalin's hold takes grip, and ends in the show trials and terror trials and a whole, mass decimation of the culture and many of its leading figures. Um, it's also a story of state sponsorship and, Yiddish writers on the payroll that were the envy of their
Mhm.
colleagues in New York and everywhere else. So it's a really remarkable story with its own sort of distinctive arc. And one of its fascinations is this really amazing wave of avant-garde and modern art that it produces by Yiddish-speaking artists such as the painter of this scene, Issachar Ber Ribak. Ribak is, should be as well known as Chagall and any other of his contemporaries, and is gradually becoming more exhibited and better known. He he does a whole series of work recalling his shtetl childhood around the time of the revolution and in the immediate years afterwards. And it's really this world, his sense of it, I think, is, a world that is just like an earthquake has hit it, which of course it had. It's everything is melting, everything is tilting, everything is sort of blown up and blown apart. There's this kind of affection for the traditional world, but at the same time, he throws in his lot with the revolution, and he's an enthusiast. So there's also this sort of critical view of the kind of traditional obscurantist, somewhat medieval worldview that
Mhm.
he's very familiar with. So those two things somehow coexist in a really interesting way in Ribak. And, rather than a documentary photograph, I think we all loved this particular image. It's one of
Mm.
his, obviously it's a wooden synagogue of the sort that you barely find today in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on. But he sketched and painted obsessively, Reback. So it just captures that upheaval, that sort of tumult of the revolution and its impact in the Yiddish world and its reflection in the Yiddish world.
A great way to introduce this section. Okay, next. Had to put this in because it's an amazing image.
Yeah, I love the fact that, we allowed this to fill up most of a 12-inch high book, and it's like a poster when you open up the pages. Yeah, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, as the cover of Der Rote Album, the Red Album, a book of radicals and revolutionaries that's published in New York, full of images, hundreds and hundreds of faces of men and women, Jewish radicals from all around the world. It's an extraordinary cover.
Next. So this is an example of one of the pages sections that pull from our story cases, which are based on artifacts, which again, it makes this real. They're attached to people and stories, so it's not just a historical overview.
Yeah, I mean, one of the glories of how this book has come together, and that's in large part thanks to you and Mike, the designer, is really that you can see book covers and book spreads that are at least the size of the originals. You can see these extraordinary artifacts really up close. So you see this watch, this fob watch, and what you see in the front are four little pinholes. You can probably see those on your screen. Um, and the headline is "A Watch with a Secret," and this is indeed a watch with a fascinating backstory. The owner of it is the guy in the photograph, Joseph Chernyavsky, a klezmer musician and a classically trained cellist from Ukraine, who has a real portmanteau career in America. He's an orchestra director, a Hollywood studio orchestra director. He writes Yiddish theater songs. Fascinating guy and fascinating story. Um, and this is a watch that he carried out through Russia, through Siberia, into Asia, and eventually into America during the Russian Civil War. And the four pinholes are there because originally it had a crest that he feared, if he didn't prize it off,
Mhm.
and if it was found, might get him killed. And if you want to see the whole story, buy the book. But like, in a nutshell, it's just a fabulous artifact, and we're super grateful to the family for lending it to us and allowing us to tell this story.
And I think what's really fun, interesting, engaging about all of this is that you did add artifacts to it. It's not, I think everybody's expectation was that this would be all book covers. And it's you needed these artifacts. I mean, this is just representative of one of 16 cases of artifacts. Okay, next. How could we resist?
So this is a yeah, I mean each of these photos is glorious. This is a spread from the theater section in the exhibition. It's on a panel that we call Women Behaving Badly. And this is from top, well, on the left, that's Molly Picon in as Schmendrick, dressed up obviously as this Hasidic boy with this kind of goofy, idiotic expression on her face. Underneath her is Clara Young, a really distinguished and influential figure, headliner in theaters around the world, kind of saucy, but also a serious actress. Very interesting. Ended up in the Soviet Union in circumstances that are somewhat mysterious and died there. And on the right, who's this? Oh, Nellie Kassman. Of course, this is Nellie Kassman. Outrageous, bawdy, saucy, risque, irreverent. And I think if we can blow this, can we blow this up
Yeah.
here? For this little quote that we use from one of her big hits, Yossel Yossel, was a song she wrote. She was a songwriter as well as a hugely popular singer. So she has this song Yossel Yossel about her husband Yossel, who takes up with a non-Jewish woman, and it has the immortal line, "Your shiksa might be sweet, but she isn't kosher meat."
Meat.
And this was she belted this song out to 2,000 people in New York theaters. It's just fabulous.
Next.
So, yes, I mean, funerals are close to our heart. Yiddish funerals are an extraordinary phenomenon. And I was going to say none bigger, but actually there is in the timeline one significantly bigger than this. This one is Sholem Aleichem's funeral in 1916 in New York City. And it is an extraordinary kind of tragic pageant. There would be souvenir sellers selling little black edge ribbons and lapel pins and all that sort of stuff. This was the scene that you would have seen throughout the length and breadth of Manhattan as the funeral cortege winds its way from the Bronx all the way down across the Brooklyn Bridge to the cemetery, and it's thought that something like 250,000 people were out on the streets that day. And you can see they're on the balconies, they're leaning out of the windows, they're climbing up lampposts. It was a national sort of pageant, really, quite an extraordinary event. And there was a sense of guilt behind it because he hadn't really made it in America in the way that he had hoped. And, who's responsible for that? The readers and the audience,
Mhm.
the theater audience primarily, because he really hoped to make it big in the theater, Yiddish theater. And he died quite suddenly, at least for most people, what was quite suddenly. So I think there was shock, there was grief, and there was definitely a sense of guilt at how his sort of later career had played out. But it's unthinkable. Who today, can you think of a writer in America who would get 5,000, even, a few thousand people turning out for their funeral? There are 250,000 people of all ages on the streets. Quite extraordinary.
Okay, and next.
So this really speaks to the sort of concept of the whole catalog and exhibition. And this is again from the theatre section. It's three posters of plays about the Dreyfus case. So you can see the guy in the peaked cap in the middle piece, and on the larger piece, in the middle of that larger piece, is Dreyfus, Captain Dreyfus, who was framed, French Jewish army officer, framed for treason and put through this 10-year long ordeal. He was exiled and put into solitary confinement. It tore France apart, the pro and anti camps, and it transfixed Jews around the world and other people around the world for 10 years. So much so that there are many, many Yiddish plays about it. And here we have Sao Paulo, Brazil on the left, we have New York in the middle, and the Standard Theatre in Shoreditch in the East End of London, which was probably the biggest theatre in London at that point, in the colourful poster on the right. And again, it just speaks to the burning, well, it speaks to many things really, the sort of intense interest in theatre and culture, but also the way in which the Yiddish theatre functioned as a sort of university of life for people who had no formal education to speak of, almost uniformly at this period. This is the 1890s and early 1900s. Um, and there were multiple plays. They were constantly being updated as the trial sort of progressed and the affair and the story progressed. And this was how people got their news of the Dreyfus case, and more than by any other means, the Yiddish audience got it from the theater.
Okay, and one more.
Which section is this in post-war?
Post-war.
Post-war. Yeah, so this is a photograph that's really just endlessly sort of thought-provoking and striking. Obviously, so this is Warsaw in the aftermath of the Nazi suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that took place in 1943. So the only way they could put out that rebellion, that sort of extraordinary act of defiance, was to bomb the entire center of Warsaw to smithereens like this. So so the myth arose after the war that nobody talked about this sort of thing. People didn't talk about the Holocaust. Nothing could be further from the truth in the Yiddish world. There are many memoirs written in 1945, 46, 47 of Polish Yiddish writers going back to Poland and just this visceral shock of seeing their whole the world familiar to them from their childhood and earlier lives just gone, everything gone. So that's what we're looking at. But then you have this girl at the side looking out on it, and she's wearing shoes that are different and many sizes too big for her. And we don't know who she is still. Polish historians and journalists have spent many years trying to find out who she is and what her story is, and we still don't know it. So it's an enigma. Why is she there? What's she looking out on, right? Um, and the quote comes from the wonderful Schneiderman, journalist, this sort of quintessential European. He's on the front lines in the Spanish Civil War. He writes one of these books of reportage. And the quote is, "A monstrous stillness sounded, only the sky has remained unchanged." If any of you know Warsaw and have been to Warsaw, in the middle of this picture is pretty much where the Polin Museum stands today, this wonderful museum of Polish Jewish history, and the ghetto monument to the ghetto fighters that is across the square from the museum. That's pretty much in the middle of where this photograph is. So, it's an enigmatic picture, and it's a picture with many stories and sort of many riddles, encoded in it. The Poles obviously saw this scene and decided to rebuild the old city of Warsaw, but they didn't rebuild any of the Jewish monuments. They didn't rebuild the great synagogue, which stood pretty much again in the center and close to the center. So I look at it and I sort of think of that, of the choices that were made after the war about what represented the sort of spirit of the nation and what didn't. And the Jewish monuments clearly didn't and weren't, considered a priority at that time. So it's just an extraordinary picture, I think.
That will end our slideshow for now. Thank you. I put you on the spot with
Oh,
rapid fire.
it's fun that way. Yeah.
So just quickly, and then let's open it up for questions. This represents just some of what is in the catalog, which is weighs in at a hefty, what is it?
Should we show it? It's 5 pounds. Ugh.
Yeah.
So it's
very large.
this size. Yes. If I had a Coca-Cola tin, it would be like this size. So we have Mark and Bella Chagall on the back, and then we have the wonderful Bundists on their picnic in London on the front.
So what you've gotten is just a little taste, as we say, of what's inside. And I'd like to open it up to questions now as I bear with me while I have to get to them. Okay. So, well, actually, it's so different. You can read them.
Put my glasses on.
You can't get an electric. Okay, so people, I'll just.
Somebody asked, how can they get an electronic copy? You can't, because sadly you have to buy it.
Yeah, it can't exist as that kind of a book.
It's not an ebook.
Yeah.
It's really a book that has to be, to look of this quality, it has to be printed.
And also it's just not possible.
Location and dating for the photos would be helpful. Well, obviously, if you buy the book, they are located and they are dated. Oh, the little white goat in Rybak's painting seems to be a precursor of the book center's logo. Nice. Yeah, well, goats are all over the shtetl and all over Jewish homes, so they're familiar to Rybak and Chagall and the others. And you chose, well, you can say why you chose the goat as the logo, I guess, for that reason partly.
Yeah, when we were looking to rebrand when I came, the idea was to find something that expanded beyond a book. And Susan Bronson and Aaron and Lansky and I sat around and anyway, we thought, a goat. And then went off and realized goat is pervasive in music, in theater, in art, everywhere. So that's that.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's a question about the Dreyfus poster. The British poster about Dreyfus tells the public that the presentation would take place Shabbos Batog. In other words, on Shabbos on Shabbat, on Saturday during the day. Comment, can you comment? Well, yes, you're right. They performed on the Sabbath. This was not, it might have been slightly controversial in some quarters, but it was a commercial decision. That was where a big audience was available. And so in later years, they didn't, I think. Post-war in London, I don't think they performed Shabbos by Tog or by Tug, but at this time, it wasn't an issue, apparently.
Okay. Y-
Y- Yiddish newspapers in New York City. What a world. Any comments about the newspaper man? Who's the newspaper man?
the newspaper man is he was in the slideshow. Maybe we can show
Oh,
he's a man in a costume in a park.
oh, that
Yeah.
that guy. Yeah, we can find him.
As they say, baseball, good eye. Dan. Oh, yeah.
Which section is he in?
He's,
But anyway, so
let me
yes,
find that while
okay.
you go on.
We don't know who he is. That photo I spotted on Facebook quite late on as we were finalizing the contents of the exhibition, and it's obviously a fascinating image. A guy wearing a costume which has the names of three of the leading Yiddish newspapers in New York in the early 20th century. The Forwards, the Jewish Daily Forwards, the Freie Arbeiterstimme, the Anarchist paper, and I think it's the Tag Morgen Journal. Anyway, three slightly politically differently oriented. Yeah,
Oops.
yeah, no, that's good. So if we hold it up, so you get a good shot of it there. So this is a photograph. So anyway, so it pops up on Facebook. Long process led to the owner sharing it with us, and but they don't know anything about it, not least whether it's a member of their family. It's a Brooklyn studio portrait, so we know it was taken in Brooklyn. That's as much as we know. Was it a fancy dress ball? He's got a sort of dancer's pose. It's just an intriguing picture that was just too good not to put in the exhibition and then in the catalog. Um,
Oh.
This is a question about, are there any images or artifacts in the exhibition or book from South Africa or other countries in Africa? Beyond the book, are there any intersections of Ladino and Yiddish cultures? Okay, well, I think we have the Hirschbeins in South Africa. I think we do have an image from South Africa of the literary couple Peretz Hirschbein and Esther Shumiatscher on tour from the 1920s. That's in the section that really shows us their travels and their voracious sort of appetite to see the world, and um, that's that picture with the car is them in South Africa. Um, I don't think we know where in South Africa, but we do know it's South Africa. So there is one. And obviously South Africa had a lively Yiddish scene. Yeah, a lot to be said about that. Ladino, well, Ladino and Yiddish are the two main European Jewish vernaculars, for sure. I mean, that's a sort of big and complicated question, but we don't, no, we don't really deal with Ladino in the exhibition and in the book, I don't think. Yeah, we deal obviously with Hebrew, which has this more sort of intimate relationship with modern Yiddish culture. It's really modern Ashkenazi culture as a sort of bilingual culture in essence. Yeah.
Can I read you one that is
Hmm.
not on the screen? What were the challenges in terms of curation?
Oh, I mean, where to start? What were the challenges? I mean, there are probably twice as many images and stories that didn't make it into the exhibition. That was a sort of process of radical whittling out and selection that was, driven by you and by the designers and people saying, it's much better to have one great story than three smaller ones, or one great picture than three smaller ones. And, as a curator, I want always to have more. And as project director and sort of, presiding genius of the catalog, and someone with a background in art, design, and publishing, you want to have less, and that's absolutely the right instinct if it means you are face to face with, life-size pictures of girls on a May Day parade in New York City, or you're face to face with newsboys selling the forwards, or in the case of the catalog, you're sort of eyeballing people, and really the images are big enough so you can relate so well to them and their lives, and that's what makes it a really, I think, beautiful and stunning and special book.
If I may, I think a challenge was, and you saw this at the beginning of this process, was artifacts
Yeah, for sure.
and gathering those, which is, I think, a kind of interesting. Maybe speak a little bit about those story cases, a couple of examples, because they find their way into the catalog throughout.
Yeah. I mean, this was a sort of, joint effort. I mean, Svi, our colleague and director of development, brought from Florida, I think the only Yiddish survivor of Hurricane Katrina that he had heard about and been told about. And yeah, there are wonderful artifacts. There's a fabulous painting of the Yiddish actress Celia Adler
Mm.
that turned up at a provincial auction that I was browsing online one day, amid the sort of chipped Meissen and, beautiful hat pins. Who knew hat pins could be so beautiful? I get it sort of fascinated by antiques and stuff like that. But here was this portrait that popped up, that just said, a portrait by the painter Ludwig Satz, which I would have probably just passed by if I hadn't recognized the face in the portrait as being that of Celia Adler, this very well-known actress. And it's clearly based on a well-known photograph of her. And then it kind of twigged in my mind that Ludwig Satz was Ludwig Satz, the actor. Now, was he also a painter? Well, it turned out he was a really, really accomplished amateur painter. And not only that, but there was a sort of romantic connection between them. Complicated story that, again, buy the book and you'll read it in full. Um, but anyway, the essence was that was a portrait that was on sale for $75 starting price, and we bought for $75, and it's stunning. It's full poster size, much bigger than this in the original. It's a very accomplished painting. And so then I read up about Ludwig Satz, who is a headliner in Yiddish theater and film in his own right. And apparently he would impersonate sort of starving artists in a bohemian garret on stage and paint a portrait in the course of a play in full view of the audience. Again, bold lives. I mean, boundless creativity. Not only is he a film and theater headliner and recording star, but he's also a brilliant artist. I mean, that I didn't know, but too good to pass up.
Which I think speaks to the idea of why these artifacts become so important to the telling of the story.
Yeah, and it's, in that case, it was okay. This is who I didn't know this about Ludwig Zatz, and here's a lovely portrait of Celia Adler, but the whole story behind it is sort of much fuller and richer and sort of, in a sense, bittersweet. Um, yeah, so artifacts, the search for artifacts were very much, I think, what we've really, if we sort of step back for a moment, what we hope we've done is really present a sort of missing piece of the Jewish story to anybody with a curiosity about, immigrant cultures, about diaspora, about identity, about community, about all these sort of basic things that are common to us today, hyphenated identities and mixed loyalties, and so. But the Yiddish story, which was the biggest single outpouring of
Mm.
Jewish literature in any Jewish language for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and formed this just a folk culture that's endlessly fascinating, is not something that most of us grew up being told about. We hear the story of the Bible and the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and the state of Israel, and that's it. And this enormous, our story is missing. And so I guess, one of the biggest gifts we can each have is self-knowledge and self-understanding. And one of the biggest gifts, I mean, to put it crudely, yeah, the book is a gift, but think of somebody who you would love to sort of know this part of their history and family story. And the book does that. I think it gives the sort of gift of self-understanding and self-knowledge, in a very palatable way. It's not encyclopedic. You can go online and find wonderful Wikipedia articles and the Evo Encyclopedia that is absolutely the sort of full story. But this is sort of storytelling windows into that really essential part of who we are.
I hope that we've intrigued our audience here in the virtual theater, because it is wonderful storytelling. It's surprising, it's different. As somebody wrote to us, how did I not know this story? Well, you'll find it here. Thank you, David, for everything you brought to this.
Thank you, and honestly, thanks to you all for watching and giving up your time to join us and sort of participate in this, this fun adventure.
So thank you again for joining us. I'd like to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, behind the scenes, who always pulls it all together, and to thank all of our members whose ongoing support makes all of this possible. Again, to Ria Schwartz and to Paul Wolf for making the book possible. Thank you. Please join us for many of our other upcoming programs. To learn more, check out our full calendar of events at yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I will mention that we are taking this show on the road, and we will be in cities across the country and hopping over the ocean to London. So please join us for a live book talk, book sale, and signing. The books are available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org, where members enjoy a 10% discount, and you can get them in time for the holiday. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we all look forward to welcoming you back to our virtual theater and hopefully to the center itself to visit us in person. Thanks again. Stay well, stay happy, and tune in again.
Thank you.